Okay, here we go. This is the next video in our series. In the last two videos, we talked about Mid-Penn Bank and where we are today. And then I gave you a kind of a brief description of the banking industry overall and all the different types of competitors we have. So what's going on out there, right? So a few weeks ago, over one weekend, we saw the collapse of two pretty big banks. These weren't, the too big to fail banks, but they were in that large regional space, more than $100 billion in assets. And you probably know the names by now, but let's talk about them. There was Silicon Valley Bank, and there was Signature Bank. So Silicon Valley Bank is from California, Signature Bank is from New York, so we got them on both sides. And let's start with the biggest of the two, which was Silicon Valley Bank. So obviously a bank that operated in that Silicon Valley area of California. They had a concentration in a deposit type. And that concentration came from venture funds. Venture funds they pull together money and they make investments in tech startups that occur in that Silicon Valley. So those venture funds had all of their money deposited at Silicon Valley Bank, and a lot of the tech startups that they invested in also did their banking at Silicon Valley Bank. So everything goes along great, but during the pandemic, when there was so much liquidity as a result of all the stimulus programs that were going on in the country, every bank in the country was awash in liquidity. We had a lot of deposits. Silicon Valley's deposits went from 60-some billion pre-pandemic to 180 billion by the end of last year, right? That sounds great, but just like every other bank, you have to do something with those deposits. So your options are to either invest them in a loan portfolio or to make securities purchases. So Silicon Valley Bank, because of that acceleration of their deposit base, they couldn't get loan growth to keep up with it, so they bought a lot of securities. And I think that the securities on their balance sheet amounted to about 55% of their assets. Just as a comparison for Mid-Penn Bank, our securities portfolio is about 15% of our balance sheet. Why is that? Because we are very active lenders and we've had great organic loan growth over the past 10 years and even during the pandemic. So they've got a lot of deposits. They came from an industry group, and we don't have any concentrations in any type of industry group in our own deposit portfolio, but they did. They had a concentration, they had a lot of money, they bought a lot of securities. The type of securities that they bought were longer term, fixed rate securities. There wasn't any risk to them. They were mostly US Treasuries. So there wasn't a risk in not getting repaid. But when you have a fixed rate securities portfolio as a bank, you either put that into held to maturity or you put it into available for sale. They put a significant amount in available for sale. Why is that important? Because the accounting rules have that if you have securities in your available for sale on a quarterly basis, you have to mark that to market. So you have to account for interest rate changes that might occur. And so if interest rates go down, a fixed rate portfolio, the value would go up, right? And if interest rates go down, the value goes up. And if interest rates go up, the value goes down. So every quarter, you have to account for any interest rate changes that occurred over that quarter. Well, obviously, when we get into 2022, there were 450 basis points of increase by the Federal Reserve throughout the year. So each quarter that they were increasing those interest rates, banks like Silicon Valley Bank and Mid-Penn Bank, we have securities in our available for sale. We had to account for that loss. But you don't account for it on your income statement. It's just an adjustment to your equity capital. So because they had 55% of their balance sheet tied up in securities, and because they bought such longer term securities and the interest rates were below 2%, and with the escalation in the rates throughout 2022, it eroded a lot of their capital. So late in the year, in the beginning of this year, all those venture funds that had their money there, They're watching their capital ratios deteriorate. They began to get nervous that they weren't going to get their money back. So they pulled together and they started to drain the bank of its deposits. So in a real short period of time, because this isn't like a traditional bank run where people were standing in lines, they're doing electronically. And it was in a coordinated fashion. And almost overnight, they lost all of their liquidity. So what do? Every bank has a liquidity contingency plan. And their executives were caught flat-footed. They didn't implement their contingency plan fast enough. They could have borrowed money from the FHLB or maybe even the Federal Reserve, but they didn't do that quickly enough. And so they felt that the only option to get money back into the company was to sell some of those securities. Once they do that, I think they sold $21 billion of securities. As soon as they did that, they took an actual loss. So this is no longer an accounting loss. This is an actual loss. That set off a panic in their stock. Once they announced that, their stock went down 80% in one day, and the bank was over. So again, compare that to Mid-Penn Bank. Their balance sheet, 55% securities, ours 15%. They had an AOCI, accumulated other comprehensive income, which is how you account for that loss baked into that portfolio. That was 12% of their capital. Ours, 3.6% of our capital. So if we had to write off our entire securities portfolio that's available for sale, it wouldn't impact our capital ratios. Our capital is strong. We don't have any concentrations of deposits. We don't have a big loss in our available for sale portfolio. And so we feel that, what happened there, which was started with, really bank mismanagement of its balance sheet, and then a poor response to the situation they were going through, that's not going to happen here. So the other bank that failed was Signature Bank. And in short, Signature Bank was like the darling of the analyst community because they got into crypto assets. And they had a lot of it on their balance sheet, and it was driving a lot of income. And there were a lot of bank analysts saying, gosh, why aren't you more like Signature Bank? Because look what they're doing there to diversify their revenues. Well, in the beginning of the year when that FTX collapsed, their crypto assets collapsed along with it. And that set off a chain of events in their own liquidity and losses in their own portfolio, and they collapsed too. We don't have any crypto assets at Mid-Penn Bank. We're a community bank, and what we do when we borrow from our customers by accepting those deposits, we generally speaking lend it in the community. We have a great loan portfolio. It's about 80% of our assets. Our loan to deposit ratios in the low 90s. So we have great loan growth. Our portfolios managed very well. We're great underwriters. We're great managers of loans. And we don't overinvest in securities, and we don't have to stretch and take, long-term risk to try to drive up the yield on our portfolio. So we're not anything like Silicon Valley Bank. We're not anything like Signature Bank. We don't do things like that. We are fundamentally strong community lenders. We get community deposits, we make community loans, and that's how we stay out of trouble.